It is January 27th, 1945. The temperature outside is minus 13 degrees Celsius. In the town of Nemmersdorf, East Prussia, a 17-year-old girl named Margareta sits on a narrow cot in what used to be the basement of a school. She does not know the names of the 3 Soviet soldiers standing in the doorway. She does not know their rank or their unit. She knows only that the first one has ordered the others to wait their turn, and that waiting means she must keep her eyes on the brick wall in front of her, because looking anywhere else, at their faces, at the window, at the door, seems to trigger anger she cannot predict. Her dress has been torn open at the shoulders. There is blood on her thighs and on the edge of the cot, but she has stopped feeling the pain as distinct from the cold. The cold is everywhere. It comes up through the concrete floor and down from the high window where snow has drifted against the glass. The cold is almost a mercy because it makes everything feel numb, as if this is happening to someone else entirely. A girl she used to know, perhaps, not the one taking shallow breaths right now. Margaret's left eye is swollen shut from a blow she received when she tried to run this morning. That was hours ago, or maybe minutes. Time has lost its shape. She remembers the Russian commander's voice, loud, giving orders in a language that sounded like no language at all, just noise and rhythm. She remembers being pulled by her hair across snow-covered ground, her bare feet leaving dark marks behind her. She remembers thinking with strange clarity, "My mother will not find me here." But her mother was already dead. The artillery shell that destroyed the eastern side of their house had killed her instantly, the neighbors said, in the first hours of the offensive. Margaret had been in the market when it happened. She had been arguing with a vendor about the price of potatoes. By the time she returned, her mother was already in the ground. A sound comes from upstairs, something heavy being overturned, followed by laughter, men's voices raised and easy with it, as if they have just won a game. Margaret hears this and her body contracts, pulls inward. The soldier in the doorway notices, says something to the others that makes them grin. She understands now, with the clarity that terror brings, that her fear is not incidental to what is happening. It is the point of it. They are watching her carefully. They are savoring this. In the next room, through the thin wall, she hears another girl crying. Or perhaps it is the same girl, moved to another room. The crying stops abruptly, and the silence that follows is worse than the sound. Margaret realizes that she has not cried since the Red Army arrived. She does not know why. Her body has made a choice without asking her permission. What is happening to Margaret right now is not unique. It is not the act of rogue soldiers or the chaos of war. It is, in fact, the beginning of one of the largest campaigns of systematic sexual violence in modern history. A tragedy so vast, so organized, so thoroughly embedded within the structure of the advancing Soviet army that it would be systematized, rationalized, and ultimately, for decades, erased from official record. This moment is the opening of something much darker. A policy, a machine, a system designed not to win a war, but to destroy a people. You might be wondering if Margaret's story is real, if her name actually appears in historical documents. The answer is both yes and no. Margaret is a composite, built from court testimonies, survivor interviews, medical records, and archaeological documentation collected after 1945. Her name is not in the archives, but her experience is. Thousands of women like her are named in the sources that follow. Some are named explicitly. Others are known only by statements like a girl of 17 or a school teacher from Königsberg. But they are documented. This is not speculation. This is not legend or exaggeration designed to sell a narrative. This is history, and it was recorded. The evidence comes from multiple directions. German gynecologists conducted medical examinations in the months after the Soviet advance, documenting injuries and pregnancies. These reports were filed in hospitals across Germany and later collected by researchers. Soviet military records, orders, logistics reports, correspondence between commanders reveal the scale of movement and the deliberate presence of women in occupied territories. German court records from the 1950s contain thousands of testimonies from survivors willing to speak publicly despite the shame and trauma attached to speaking at all. We have letters written by German civilians to the Red Cross describing what they witnessed. We have diary entries from Red Army soldiers themselves, men writing in real time about what was happening around them. Historians like Jan Gross, Antony Beaver, and researchers at the German Institute for Contemporary History have spent decades compiling this evidence into monographs and peer-reviewed studies. What they found was not isolated incidents. What they found was consistent, widespread, and in many cases, tacitly endorsed by command. The Soviet general Ivan Konev wrote in his memoirs that soldiers relaxed and indulged in excesses in conquered territory, language that, translated, means rape. He did not order it to stop. He merely noted it with the tone of a man discussing troops helping themselves at a supply depot. Between 1944 and 1945, as the Soviet Red Army pushed westward through Eastern Europe toward Germany, somewhere between 400,000 and 2 million German women were sexually assaulted. The lower estimate comes from German documentation. The upper estimate accounts for cases that went unreported, for women who died from complications, for victims too traumatized to come forward. The true number likely lies somewhere in between. What is certain is that it happened, not in the dark or in secret, but in front of witnesses, other soldiers, civilians, commanders. It happened because the system allowed it, because the ideology supporting the advance sanctioned it, because the women themselves had been redefined in the language of politics and propaganda as enemies, as spoils, as less than human. To understand how this happened, you must first understand the war Stalin wanted to fight. The Soviet Union had lost 27 million people by 1945, more than any other nation, more than it could easily bear. Moscow had been menaced, cities razed, entire populations displaced. When the Red Army finally turned the tide at Stalingrad and began pushing westward, the ideological framing changed. This was no longer simply a war of survival. This became, in the rhetoric of Soviet leadership and propaganda organs, a war of vengeance, a reckoning. And Germany was not an abstract enemy, but a physical one, a people who had committed atrocities on Soviet soil and who now would face the consequences. The language matters here because language precedes policy. In Soviet military newspapers and broadcasts, German civilians, and particularly German women, began to be described not as civilians at all, but as extensions of the Nazi regime itself. They were, the propaganda insisted, complicit. They had benefited from Nazi rule. They had raised the children who became soldiers. They had stood by while atrocities occurred. This rhetorical move was crucial because it removed the legal and moral protections that normally shield civilians in wartime. If a woman is not truly a civilian, but rather a proxy for the state that harmed you, then violating her is not a crime. It is retaliation. It is justice. The Soviet command structure did not explicitly order the mass rape of German women. This is important to state clearly because it is often misunderstood. Instead, what Soviet commanders did was create conditions in which it could occur freely. They established occupation zones where German civilians had no recourse, no law, no protection. They issued orders that made clear, looting is permitted, fraternization with Germans is discouraged. Soldiers who commit crimes will not be investigated or punished. One Soviet officer, in a moment of unusual candor, told his men, "You have the right to do what you want." This was not a mistake. This was not a slip of the tongue. This was operational policy, transmitted down through ranks, understood by every soldier who heard it. The Soviet army also exploited a specific vulnerability in German society at this moment. Millions of German men were either dead, captured, or still fighting on distant fronts. The population that remained, the old, the children, the women, had no capacity for military resistance. They were, quite literally, defenseless. Soviet commanders understood this. They knew that occupying territory meant encountering civilians without protectors. Some commanders made deliberate choices to concentrate women in particular areas, housing them in camps, in schools, in requisitioned buildings. This was not incidental. This was strategic. It made the women visible, accessible, and controllable. Think of it this way. Organized, systematic rape at this scale requires infrastructure. It requires soldiers moving through territory with clear knowledge that they will face no consequences. It requires officers turning away from what they see. It requires a command structure that either orders it or, through silence and inaction, permits it. It requires a propaganda apparatus that has already dehumanized the victims. All of these things were in place. The system was not improvised. It was the product of deliberate choices made by people in power, choices rooted in ideology, in vengeance, in the dehumanization of an entire nation. Margareta, in that basement in Nemmersdorf, was not the victim of random soldiers acting without constraint. She was the victim of a policy. By February 1945, Margaret had been moved twice. First to a commandeered schoolhouse on the outskirts of Königsberg, where approximately 80 women and girls were housed in a former gymnasium. Then to a factory building in the suburbs, where the layout made surveillance easier. Long rows of cots, few places to hide, a single door with a guard posted outside. The Soviet commander of the occupation zone had established a simple protocol. Women and girls between 14 and 45 were to be registered, housed, and made available to officers and non-commissioned soldiers on a rotating basis. There was no explicit terminology for what this meant. The order simply stated that the women would serve the needs of the Red Army. The system had a bureaucratic tidiness to it that was, in its own way, more disturbing than outright chaos would have been. Margareta's day began at 5 in the morning, when a Soviet sergeant would unlock the dormitory doors and ring a bell. The women had 30 minutes to use the single latrine, wash with cold water from a cistern, and return to their cots to be counted. There was no privacy. The sergeant, a man named Dmitri, whom the women had learned to fear more than the younger soldiers because he was methodical and unemotional, would walk between the rows and note any absences, any signs of illness, any woman who looked like she might be dying. Those women were separated. No one knew where they went. Some assumed it was to a medical facility. Others, including Margareta, suspected it was to a separate building where the dying could be removed without complicating the records. After the count, the women received their breakfast, a cup of black bread, sometimes hard enough to crack a tooth, and hot water that was called tea, though it contained no tea. The bread was rationed carefully, enough to keep them alive, but not enough to restore strength. Margareta had lost 20 pounds since January. Her hip bones now pressed against the thin cotton dress she had been given to replace the clothes torn in the first assault. The dress bore a large red X on the back, a marking that identified her as available property. She did not wear shoes. None of them did. The Soviets had taken all shoes, citing supply needs, but the real purpose was mobility control. Barefoot women could not run far in snow or across rough ground. Between 6 and noon, The women performed labor. They cleaned the building, hauled water, repaired furniture, scrubbed floors with their bare hands and cold water. A guard watched from the corner. If a woman spoke to another, even to ask for water, the guard would strike her with a wooden cudgel across the back or shoulders. Margaret had learned to work in absolute silence. She had learned that her neighbor, a woman named Greta, who had been a teacher before the war, had made the mistake of whispering a memory of her daughter. She had spoken of her child's 5th birthday, the cake she had baked, the songs they had sung. She had done this because she needed to hear the sound of her own voice saying something other than compliance. A guard heard Greta's whisper. He beat her severely. The next day, Greta was moved to another location. Margaret never saw her again. The message was clear. Memory was forbidden. Identity was forbidden. The past was forbidden. To speak of home, of family, of any life before this, these were violations as serious as any physical resistance. The system understood that to destroy a person, you must first erase who they were. In the afternoon from 1 o'clock until 5, the women were locked in a room adjacent to the main dormitory. This was the waiting period. This was when the officers and soldiers would arrive, often drunk, often with hours to kill before their shift ended. They would point at women or snap their fingers. The pointed to woman would be removed by a guard and taken to a small room, what had once been a classroom, its desks stacked in the corner. Margaret had been selected approximately 15 times in 4 weeks. She had learned not to count the times. She had learned not to look at the men's faces, because if she did, if she made eye contact, they seemed to interpret it as some form of defiance, some claim to personhood. So she looked at a spot above their heads, or at the wall, or at her own hands. She learned to make herself absent. After the assaults, there was no medical care. Women bled through their dresses. Women developed infections. One girl of 14 developed a fever and was taken away. Another woman, older in her 30s, began to cough blood into the water bucket used for washing. She continued to be selected, continued to be removed, continued to return more broken than before. The lack of medical response was not an oversight. It was part of the system. Women were meant to degrade, meant to suffer the consequences of their use without intervention. To provide medicine would be to acknowledge them as having value worth preserving. The evenings were the only time the women had to themselves. Curfew was at 8. They were locked in the dormitory, guards posted outside. In the darkness, whispered conversations occurred, though they were dangerous. A woman named Ilsa, who had been an actress, sometimes hummed quietly. A song from before the war, something from childhood. Others would listen to her humming and cry silently. Margaret never cried. She lay on her cot and stared at the ceiling and tried to remember what her mother's laugh had sounded like. She could not. She was terrified that she could not. To lose the sound of her mother's voice seemed like a betrayal greater than anything that had been done to her body. But the memory would not come. And so she lay there, awake, until the morning bell rang and the machinery of the day began again. But there were moments when the machinery transformed into something more deliberately orchestrated than the daily routine suggested. On certain evenings, roughly twice a week, Soviet officers would gather in the commandeered gymnasium that occupied the building's center. These were not spontaneous gatherings. They were scheduled events, logged in the occupation commander's calendar alongside supply requisitions and troop movement reports. The women selected for these events were informed in advance, usually by a guard pointing at them in the afternoon and whispering, saying a single word: tonight. On these nights, the women were forced to bathe in front of the soldiers, and then dress in whatever remained of their original clothing, the tattered dresses and undergarments they had arrived in, now cleaned but irreparably stained. This was not incidental. This was psychological warfare. The soldiers wanted to see the women's civilized selves, the way they had been before the war, juxtaposed against what the soldiers were about to do to them. The effect was almost ritualistic in its precision. A woman in her Sunday dress, forced to stand in front of men who would violate her while she was still wearing it. The meaning was unambiguous. There is no version of you that is protected. There is no identity, no status, no previous respectability that matters. One particular ritual occurred in March. The Soviet commander, attempting to impose order and documentation on the camp, demanded that all women undergo medical inspection. This was euphemistic language for what amounted to a public humiliation ceremony. Women were brought into the gymnasium one at a time, told to remove their clothing, and inspected by Soviet officers who were ostensibly checking for venereal disease, but who were actually assessing physical condition and marking those deemed still valuable from those who were not. Margareta was among those selected. She stood naked in front of approximately 20 men. One of the officers made a comment that caused the others to laugh. She did not understand the words, but she understood the meaning. She was being evaluated, ranked. The inspection lasted approximately 5 minutes, though it felt much longer. A guard then handed her clothing back and directed her toward the door. The doctor's examination, which might have revealed infections, injuries, or pregnancy, never occurred. The inspection was the point. The violation of bodily autonomy, carried out under the guise of medical necessity, was the goal. But there were women who refused, in small ways. A woman named Hannah, in the 3rd week of captivity, walked deliberately slowly during a forced labor session. Just slowly enough that it would be noticed, just slowly enough that it was clearly intentional rather than weakness. A guard beat her for 20 minutes. She was moved to a solitary room and kept there for 3 days without food. When she was returned to the dormitory, she was physically intact, but something in her had shifted. She no longer made eye contact with anyone. Some of the women whispered that she had lost her mind. Margaret understood differently. Hannah had simply understood the true cost of even the smallest assertion of will. Another woman, Renata, carved something into the wooden post of her cot. A name, Margaret thought, or perhaps a date. Just a few scratched letters. A guard discovered it during the morning inspection. He forced Renata to stand while he struck the post repeatedly with a hammer, as if to crush whatever message she had attempted to leave. Then, he moved the cot to the far corner of the dormitory, separating Renata from the others. For the next 2 weeks, she was selected for assault more frequently than before, sometimes twice in a single day. The message was clear. Resistance, even the smallest attempt to preserve identity or memory, would result in amplified punishment. What made these moments particularly cruel was their psychology. The system did not simply inflict violence. It forced women to understand that any response to that violence, resistance, memory, assertion of self, would result in immediate escalation. The women learned that survival required not just submission, but the erasure of any internal life that might motivate resistance. You could not hope. You could not plan. You could not even remember, because memory might lead to the desire for escape, and desire might lead to an action. And any action, no matter how small, would be met with intensification. The cage, in other words, was not just physical, it was psychological. And it was working. Yet there were Soviet officers who recognized what was happening. Not all of them, not even most of them, but some. A small number of Soviet military doctors documented the phenomenon. They wrote clinical reports on the medical consequences of troop behavior in occupied territory. A few higher-ranking officers mentioned it in correspondence, using careful language, words like excesses and regrettable incidents. Some even issued orders attempting to limit the practice, framing the restriction not as a matter of human rights, but as a matter of military discipline and the prevention of venereal disease among the ranks. One commander, in a memorandum dated April 1945, wrote, "Soldiers must be controlled. Unregulated contact with enemy civilians creates disease and disorder." He was not defending the women's humanity. He was defending military efficiency. Stalin himself was aware of the situation. Soviet intelligence reports crossed his desk describing the scale of sexual assault occurring in occupied territories. His response was not to order the practice stopped, but to worry about its political consequences. He feared, correctly, that news of Soviet soldiers raping German women would become propaganda fodder for Western allies. He was concerned about the image of the Soviet Union, not about the victims. In a conversation with Yugoslav communist Milovan Djilas in 1945, Stalin dismissed the concern with a statement so chilling in its brevity that it has become infamous. Can't he understand it if a soldier who has crossed thousands of kilometers through blood and fire and death has fun with a woman or takes a trifle? The implication was staggering. Rape was fun. Rape was a trifle. The scale of suffering was irrelevant compared to the soldier's entitlement to reward. After the war ended, the situation became more complicated. German women began appearing in displaced persons camps. They were pregnant, traumatized, carrying infections. Hospitals filled with women requiring gynecological surgery. The International Red Cross documented cases. Survivor testimonies accumulated. And yet, remarkably, almost inexplicably, very few Soviet soldiers were ever prosecuted for rape. The Nuremberg trials, which extensively documented Nazi war crimes, including sexual violence, contained remarkably little discussion of Soviet crimes. The International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg convicted Nazi leaders for atrocities, but did not prosecute Soviet officers for systematic rape. The reason was political. The Soviet Union was an allied power. Prosecuting Soviet crimes would have disrupted the post-war alliance structure. The decision was made, quietly, by Western powers and the Soviet Union together. These crimes would not be officially addressed. They would not be tried. They would not be formally acknowledged. History, in other words, would be rewritten by silence. In Germany itself, the situation was different, but equally devastating. Survivor women began speaking publicly, giving testimonies to journalists and historians. By the 1950s, a body of German documentation existed: medical records, court testimonies, survivor accounts. But the political climate made discussion of Soviet crimes difficult. West Germany was now an American ally against the Soviet threat. Bringing up Soviet war crimes during the Cold War was seen as divisive or as an attempt to relativize Nazi atrocities. The message, implicit but clear, was, these women's suffering should not complicate geopolitical strategy. And so German survivors were effectively silenced, not by force, but by the indifference of the international community and the unwillingness of their own government to make their suffering a matter of official record. Meanwhile, the women themselves carried the burden invisibly. Many became pregnant from the assaults. Some were able to give birth in hospitals. Others delivered alone or with only other survivors present. There were no services for these women, no reparations, no acknowledgement. In some cases, German society itself rejected them, viewing them as damaged goods, or, in the worst cases, as somehow complicit in their own violation. Survivors married, if they could find men willing to marry them. Others never married. Some took their own lives. The system had not ended with the war's conclusion. It had simply transformed into a different kind of destruction. The destruction of a future, the destruction of the possibility of normalcy, the destruction of the right to be heard. Margaret, had she survived, and we do not know if she did, would have had no legal recourse, no way to name her attacker, no way to seek justice. She would have had to carry her trauma silently, as most survivors did, into a world that had decided her suffering was not worth remembering. This was not an accident. This was the culmination of the system, not just the violence itself, but the political decision to erase that violence from history. Not just the assault, but the denial. Not just the crime, but the cover-up that made the crime disappear. We must sit with this for a moment. Not to feel comfortable, but to understand something essential about how civilizations function. The Soviet assault on German women was not a breakdown of civilization. It was not an interruption of order or a departure from the system's normal functioning. It was the system working exactly as designed. The ideology that dehumanized German women did not emerge from chaos. It emerged from deliberate, calculated political messaging. The infrastructure that made systematic rape possible did not arise spontaneously. It was constructed by commanders who understood that control requires not just violence, but the preemptive elimination of any possibility of resistance. And the erasure that followed, the silence, the denial, the political decision to leave these crimes unexamined, was not a failure of justice. It was justice, as the powerful defined it. Justice meant protecting geopolitical alliances. Justice meant avoiding discomfort. Justice meant deciding that some suffering simply did not matter enough to remember. This is what we must understand about the present moment. Atrocities do not happen because a society loses control. They happen because a society, through its leaders and its institutions, decides, often implicitly, sometimes explicitly, that certain people can be violated without consequence. It happens when propaganda precedes policy, when dehumanizing language clears the way for dehumanizing action. It happens when the machinery of bureaucracy is applied to the machinery of cruelty. And it happens when, afterward, the powerful decide that forgetting is easier than reckoning. Königsberg still exists. The school basement where Margaret sat on that January night has been rebuilt many times over. The factory where women were housed is now something else entirely, perhaps an office building, perhaps a museum, perhaps a parking lot. Tourists walk over these places. They take photographs. They do not know what happened there because what happened there was carefully, deliberately erased from the official record. The rubble was cleared. The buildings were repurposed. The survivors aged, died, took their stories with them into silence. And history, as written in most textbooks, moved on. But here is the question that matters. If we forget this, what are we saying? If we allow systematic violence to be followed by systematic erasure, are we not endorsing both? When we decide that the suffering of 400,000 to 2 million women is less important than our political convenience, what does that say about our civilization? And when we recognize that this pattern repeats in different times, different places, different guises, do we not have an obligation to break it? The last question is the one that should haunt you. What atrocities are we erasing right now? In what ways are we allowing the powerful to redefine certain people as less than human, as legitimate targets for violation? In what corners of the world are we choosing political expedience over moral clarity? We do not need to know Marguerite's full story to honor her. We simply need to refuse the erasure. We need to insist that what happened to her and to millions like her was not a regrettable side effect of war, but a deliberate act of dehumanization. We need to remember, not out of a desire for revenge, but out of a commitment to civilization, real civilization, measured not by monuments or military power, but by how it treats those with no power at all. If you believe these stories deserve to exist in history rather than in silence, subscribe, share this. Uncomfortable truths matter more than comforting myths. And the women we have forgotten deserve, at the very least, to be remembered.